In Luke chapter 4, when Satan was tempting Jesus, he went straight for his most desired things. Jesus was hungry, so he said, hey, make some rocks into bread. He took him up to this high point on the mountain, and he said, look at all these kingdoms. I'll give it all to you. He was really tugging at Jesus' desires. Obviously, Jesus didn't give into it. He said, I serve God, and he quoted scripture to remind Satan of whose will he was following. But it struck me today as I was reading the temptation of Jesus here. One of the temptations Satan says is, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. And this is an interesting part of the temptation, because Satan doesn't just tempt him. He actually quotes scripture back to Jesus. He says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it's written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. It's almost as if Satan is saying, look, God has promised this, so why don't you do it? And how does Jesus respond? Notice what he says. Jesus answered him, it is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. What's Jesus saying? Jesus is not saying, no, I'm not going to do that because God can't. Jesus is saying, I'm not going to do that because I already know God can and God will. You see, for Jesus to indulge Satan in this temptation, to cast himself off and say, okay, I'll show you what God can do, it doesn't do anything to promote God. That's a losing battle anyways. Even if Jesus casts himself down and God bears him up, what's it going to do? What's it going to prove? Satan is still going to be Satan. The point is this. Oftentimes Satan deceives us into thinking we need to prove something to ourselves, prove something to somebody else. When in reality, we just need to rest in our confidence that God is who God says he is. We don't need to test him. We don't need to say, God, if you do this, then I'll follow you. You see, our testing of God shows our weakness of faith. And I'm not saying that there aren't times when we have doubts and we need God's confirmation. But the reality is that as we mature in our faith, we don't just need to ask God to do things just for the sake of him doing things. We need to trust that God is who he says he is, that he can do what he says he's going to do. We don't need to prove that over and over and over again. God certainly will prove who he is whenever it offers him greater glory, but if we're just trying to make deals with God, that's not what he's about. Doesn't do him any good. And that's why Jesus said, doing that would be like putting God to the test. And the scriptures say, don't do that. We don't need to do that. We just need to trust that God is who he says he is, that he will do what he says he will do. We don't need to go casting ourselves into a situation.